So thank you for the introduction, and also I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation. So it's a pleasure to talk today. And I would like also to apologize if you will notice my different style of the talk compared to previous day. So I have a background in theoretical physicists and in theoretical physics and theoretical physics of disorder systems. So I apologize for this. So today I would like to discuss evidence of disordered phases in large random interactive ecosystems. So this talk is essentially based on these two papers that were done in collaboration with a bunch of people at ENS in Paris during my former postdoc. So as you know very well, so theoretical ecology has gathered momentum in recent years, reached by an explosion of experimental results and increasingly sophisticated techniques, but also motivated by crucial questions that still need an answer from a theoretical perspective, and range, for instance, from how does the diversity affect the evolution of the other species? What about cooperative patterns? Are these patterns ordered, disordered? How does an ecosystem respond to an external perturbation? And can we quantify these functional responses in a similar way as we do for physical systems? And also, is the same real ecosystem more likely to display a single equilibrium phase or a multiple equilibrium regime? Well, to answer all these questions, people have used different approaches, different strategies. One of these is, for instance, to focus on a small number of species in an ecosystem, and then one can employ the theory of dynamical system and perform a linear stability analysis. And we also had the possibility to listen to many talks in the previous day with many rigorous mathematical results, so very nice and rigorous mathematical results. But today I would like to present a complementary perspective, and so to focus on ecosystem formed by a large number of species. And so to see what happens when the number of species or resources in an ecosystem is ideally infinite. And so things get complicated quickly in this case, but we can take advantage of statistical mechanics tools and statistical mechanics of disorder systems to try to describe emergent mechanisms and collective behaviors in terms of phase transitions. So here I reported just a few works that opened the route to this new direction, starting with Solé, Alonso, and McCain in 2002 and going on with Kessler and Schreb in 2015. And I also have been working on two benchmarks in theoretical ecology from a physicist perspective. So on the MacArthur model, on the one hand, that is considered a purely competitive model, and on the Lotka-Volterra model, or better, a generalized Lotka-Volterra model with random interaction among the species. And that can be either competitive or cooperative, depending on some tunable parameters that are involved in the interaction matrix. And today I would like to focus on these two first papers. So the last one is a recent paper that we have done in collaboration with a student of mine, and is based on a Lotka-Volterra model with strong competition. But I don't have time to touch up on this other research field. So I would like to focus on the first two papers and to introduce the random Lotka-Volterra model. So what's this? So this model has been introduced almost 1 century ago by Lotka-Volterra with a small number of species, and then more recently also by Jeff Arnoldi and other people. So basically it was proven, it was shown to be a good reference model, a good platform for capturing many different features for various community models that include cascade prediction, plant pollinator, impact, and many other ecological and biological contexts. So the starting point is the dynamical equation for the relative species abundances, Ni, where relative means that this population have been normalized by the total number of individuals in the pools without any interactions. And I is an index that runs from 1 to S, where S is the total number of species. So this dynamical equation, this Langevin equation, contains a first self-regulation term that can be written in this simple case as a gradient of a one-species potential. And so for the Lotka-Volterra case, the one-species potential is quadratic in the species abundances. So as you can see, it has just two fixed points, one in 0 that is an unstable fixed point that corresponds to the extinction, and another one in Ki that is the carrying capacity that is a stable fixed point. So this means that if one species I experiences overcrowding in the immediate environment, it will be pushed back to its own value of the carrying capacity Ki. Then we have this interaction part that depends on this coefficient alpha j that I'm going to better detail in a while. And then to complexify a little bit this model and also to make it more realistic and to make comparison with real data and experiments, we introduce a demographic source of stochasticity that is this noise, that scale as square root of ni. So it's a demographic noise. And on top of that, we also include an immigration rate, lambda I, that in the following we will fix equal for all the species. So lambda I is equal to lambda. So the main assumption to get an exactly solvable model is to solve from a well-mixed community. So as you can see, there is no space dependence in ni, it just depends on time. Then we can discuss what happens when you also try to introduce space in this model. We model the demographic fluctuation as a white Gaussian noise. So eta I is a white Gaussian noise with zero mean and variance given by this expression, where the amplitude is denoted as t, and is delta correlated in time. So it is described by a delta of I and j and delta of t minus t prime. And on top of that, so the most interesting assumption for us is that how do we model this interaction alpha j? Well, in principle, it's an open field of research, so we are not able to infer this alpha j. So it's an open field of research, and in the sense that people try to use statistical analysis and inference techniques to try to extrapolate the actual interaction among species. So here we are following Robert May, who was a pioneer in this field for study stability and complexity by using random matrix theory techniques. And so we assume this alpha j to be random, extracted from a given distribution, which is just parameterized by the first two moments, mu over s and sigma squared over s. Then you can also consider another parameter that would be the correlation between alpha j and alpha ji, that basically it's a Pearson coefficient, so it measures the degree of asymmetry or symmetry among your species, between your species. So here, in the following, I would like to focus on the simplest possible scenario, so where this correlation is equal to 1, and so basically I want to focus on symmetric interactions when alpha j is equal to alpha ji, because basically, in this particular case, the dynamical equation, the Langevin dynamics that I showed before, admits an invariant probability distribution that can be written in this way. So as the exponential of minus h over t, where h is the Hamiltonian operator. So it contains a first quadratic terms that immediately come into play when you do the mapping from the one species potential. An interacting part that for us is interesting because it allows us to mark and to underline one more the mapping with disorder systems. So this is something like a spin glass term in disorder literature, in disorder system jargon. And then when we perform the mapping between a dynamical approach and the static formalism by passing through a Fokker-Planck equation, we end up with other two terms. So a demographic noise that is proportional to t log of ni, and another term that is properly introduced to model the immigration. So what is this term and what is the problem? So when we introduce a finite demographic noise, we cannot prevent all the one species from reaching very, very small abundances. And so for this reason, we have to introduce a suitable immigration parameter that can be modeled in different ways. So one can introduce a strong immigration parameter that scales as n2 minus alpha with alpha positive, or in this particular case, we can try to introduce a cutoff. And so this cutoff is modeled by an Heaviside function. So the Heaviside function is 1 when ni is greater than lambda, and so this term in this particular case does not matter. But when ni is smaller than lambda, the Heaviside function is 0, the log of 0 is minus infinity, and with a negative sign provides a reflecting wall, an arc-repulsive boundary. And so we are basically preventing species from reaching very, very small value and to get an absorbing boundary in ni equal to 0. So this model was originally studied from a physical perspective by Boonin, and here later by Boonin and collaborators, without noise and without immigration. And so they established this phase diagram where sigma is the heterogeneity parameter, so the standard deviation of this interaction matrix alpha j, as a function of mu, which is the mean interaction. And so if you go in this direction, you have a more competitive regime, and if you go on the left side, you have a more cooperative regime. So what they notice is that when the interactions are weak or highly homogeneous, the system is in a single equilibrium phase. Then you can pretend to add sigma, so to move in this direction, and you will cross the orange line, which is a stability line of this single equilibrium phase, and the system will enter this multiple equilibrium regime. Now we can wonder, what are the typical features of this equilibrium? Are they stable? Are they unstable? Are they marginally stable? And also, how many equilibria are there? Well, to answer this question, I reintroduce the demographic noise, and I properly study the interplay between this source, this intrinsic source of stochasticity, and this immigration parameter, lambda. And as I said, to do this, I used a particular techniques in this order system that is called the replica method, the replica computation. So what is the problem? So these interaction, alpha j, are random interaction. So they imply an average for the free energy, because the free energy becomes a disordered quantity. And so the free energy should be computed as the average of the log of the partition function. But we are not able to do so. This is a very nasty computation. So what we can do by using this replica trick is basically to compute the log of the average of a replicated partition function, when n stands for the number of replicas, the number of copies of your system. And just in the end, you take the analytical continuation and go into 0. And so this is the replica trick or the replica method that was introduced before Parisi, but it took 30 years to be proven, and to be proven by mathematicians, by Talagan and Guerra. And so they proved rigorously that this method is exact, is correct. And so the idea is that we need to compute this average over this alpha j, that I repeat represent our sequential disorder in the system. And since these alpha j are Gaussian, we end up with the introduction of two other parameters. One is UAB, which is the overlap matrix, so between species abundances in the replica A and the species abundances in the replica B. So it's called overlap in the sense that it measures the degree of similarity between two replicas of the same system, and HA, which is a sort of mean abundance. And so we end up with this expression of the free energy that has a more simple expression, so an expression which is more easy to tackle with. And so basically, so the free energy, the partition function, is written as an integral over QAB, QA, and HA. And since we are interested in the large S-size limits, so we have just to take the Laplace method, so to compute the saddle point approximation, to perform a saddle point approximation over this action. And so then we can take advantage of different approximations that represent different ansatz in the replica computation. So the simplest possible scenario is the replica symmetric ansatz, meaning that this matrix QAB, so this overlap matrix, is just parameterized by two values, one on the diagonal and another one on the off-diagonal. And this approximation has been shown to be correct, typically when you are high temperature or you don't introduce an external field that can break your symmetry. But when you are in the low temperature regime or you are somehow breaking your symmetry, you need to improve these ansatz. And so one possible strategy is to introduce a one-step replica symmetry breaking ansatz, meaning that this n times n matrix is now split in n over m blocks. And now you have two different other parameters that are this Q1 in the innermost block and Q0 in the outmost block. So if you want to rephrase this matrix formalism in terms of the landscape structure, you have now these two parameters that represent, respectively, in a sort of cartoon in the landscape structure, Q0, that is the size of the largest basis of attraction, and Q1, which is the size of the innermost and deepest basis of attractions. So given these mathematical premises, what I would like to do, so my goal was to characterize collective properties and emerging behavior in large ecosystem by using these disorder system techniques, and in particular try to highlight the mapping with disorder phases. And so what I did is to analyze the harmonic fluctuation of my free energy. So I compute the second derivative of this action A with respect to QAB and QCD that takes this form. And I properly diagonalize the stability matrix on 3 different subsectors. And I look at the smallest eigenvalue of the stability matrix that is called in jargon replicon. And so as you can see, it measures the fluctuation between the first and the second moment of my mean abundance. And so I try to basically generalize this phase diagram for the heterogeneity parameter as a function of the mean interaction. So you can pretend here to add another dimension to this phase diagram that represents the amplitude of the demographic noise. And what happens? So basically, I notice that there is no sensitive dependence of the average interaction parameter. So we can just focus on this part of the phase diagram for t as a function of sigma, the heterogeneity parameter. And so now I'm going to better detail these phase diagrams. So what happens? When you are sufficiently high demographic noise, the system is in a single equilibrium phase, meaning that your landscape is purely convex. Then you can start decreasing t, the amplitude of your noise, or increasing sigma, so the heterogeneity parameter, and you will cross this blue line, that is an instability line of the single equilibrium phase, and you will enter this multiply equilibria phase that start to be characterized by a 2-level structure. And so I also characterize this intermediate phase in terms of the number of equilibria that are there. There you can compute how many locally stable equilibria are there, so I computed complexity or configurational entropy. And here, so in between the blue line and the orange line, I plot basically the complexity at different values of t, and I found a strictly positive value for this complexity sigma, meaning that the number of equilibria has to be exponential into the system size, exponential into the number of species. So this is a first quantitative outcome in this direction, even if we're just considering symmetric interaction. And this quite timely also if you think about stability landscape and ecological resilience concept that have been proposed over the years to try to explain and to justify this apparent emergence of multiple steady states and multiple equilibria in a real system. And there have been also more recent results by the group of Jeff Core dating back just to 2021, in which they consider basically a mesocosm, an ecosystem with 48 different species. But for us, more interesting, there exists another phase that was not anticipated, not predicted before in this context, that I call a Gardner Phase in analogy with the glassy system in the low temperature regime. So when you cross also this orange line, which is the instability line of the one-step replica symmetry breaking phase, you will enter a fractal phase in the sense that each of these basins of attraction splits shatters into many subbasins according to a hierarchical and fractal structure. And so this phase was observed for the first time in 2014 in glassy system in the very low temperature phase. And so we also proved that also in this context, so in this random Lotka-Volterra model, you can observe this phase. So it's quite nice for us. And it partially signals an analogy with glassy system in the very low temperature regime. So basically, this gives a general framework in terms of the dynamics or the thermodynamics. So we perform an analytical computation by using this replica method. Then we can claim what happens in terms of the dynamics. So we also study dynamical correlation function. So in particular, we look at this correlator of the single species n at time t and the species at time t prime. And so this means that we average over all sources of randomness. So the number of samples, the demographic stochasticity, the random interaction, and also the initial condition, because we have a probability for the initial condition. And so we studied these correlators, these dynamical correlators in the first 2 phases, so in the single equilibrium phase and the multiple equilibria phase. So in the single equilibrium phase, as you reasonably expect, so all the correlators obtained for different t primes collapses to the same value. That is the theoretical predicted value within the replica method, so Q0. Because here you have just a convex landscape landscape. So your landscape is just characterized by one single equilibrium, and so you have just one parameter that is this Q0 that represents the size of your basin of attraction. But what happens if you go deeper and deeper in T or increasing sigma? Well, here the system enters a multiple equilibrium phase. But when you look at the dynamics, well, the dynamics never stops, never settles down in any of these equilibrium, but start to explore the basin of attraction of the most numerous and marginally stable direction. So as you can see, there is the apparent emergence of two different plateaus. And again, this dashed line corresponds respectively to Q1 and Q0 that I explained before in the replica computation. So the size of the basin of the largest basin of attraction and the deepest basin of attraction in the replica computation. And so another difference is that here you can stop basically at 10 to the 2, so it's a reasonable value to stop and to see that the dynamics converge. But here we're right up to 10 to the 7, and the curves are not so clean. So we should go farther. We should go at least to 10 to the 10 to the 11. So it's a clear signature of an aging dynamics. So the older the system, the longer it takes to decorrelate. And so this first part of my talk basically was focused on a Lotka-Volterra model with purely competitive interaction. Then you can wonder what happens when you also plug in your system cooperative interaction. And so what happens? And so in the next part of my talk, I would like to focus on intra-specific cooperative effect. And so this second part of my talk basically somehow connects also to Diana Fusco's talk on Monday, where she talked about pulled and pushed waves in cooperative models. So here we don't have space, so we cannot observe pulled or pushed waves, but a nice generalization of these models, of this framework, could involve pushed waves instead of only pulled waves. And this is specifically due to this cooperative effect. So to go beyond a purely logistic growth behavior, we start from the same dynamical equation that we have here, where in the presence of demographic noise and immigration, we model this demographic noise always in this way, where T is the amplitude of the noise, but we slightly modified this potential in such a way not to have a quadratic potential in the species abundance, but to have a higher order single species potential. So if you look at this single species potential, now it emits 3 fixed points, always one in 0, that correspond to the extinction, another one in Ki that correspond to the carrying capacity, but now we have a third fixed point, M, that correspond to the Allee threshold. So with this choice of the potential, we are now able to model the so-called Allee effect that describes a positive correlation between per capita growth rate, or mean individual fitness, and population density. So it's a positive feedback mechanism. And so as you can see from this plot, the Allee effect is called strong and is plotted in red if there exists a threshold, a finite threshold in population density that corresponds to a positive value of this parameter M, below which the population goes extinct, and is called weak and is plotted in orange if no threshold in the population exists, but there is still a per capita growth rate increase as population increases. And so this is specifically due to this cooperative aggregation effect. So this effect was first observed by a famous zoologist, so Allee, who noticed that not only competition, but also undercrowding can contribute to limit the population growth. And so more recently, it has gained an increasing popularity also in other contexts like engineering biology, the analysis of cancer cell evolution, or basic epidemiological models, because it has been observed that when you consider a basic epidemiological model in the presence of a strong Allee effect, you can observe surprisingly rich dynamics such as self-sustained oscillation or catastrophic collapses of endemic equilibria. And another noteworthy example is, for instance, in microbial community. So when you consider a chemostat, you plug 2 different species at 2 different density, and then by tuning the dilution parameter of your chemostat, you can basically switch from a monostable behavior to a bistable behavior. And so here I give some insights, so a theoretical flavor of the different situation. So then the introduction of the cubic potential from our perspective complicates analysis, but in any case, it allows us to get some theoretical advance, some theoretical prediction. So here in blue, I plot the fixed point of the Lotka-Volterra model. So in the Lotka-Volterra model, you have just two fixed points, one in 0 that is always unstable, and another one in the carrying capacity that is always stable. Here, with the strong Alli effect that is plotted in orange, you have three fixed points, but this fixed point in 0 that was unstable before becomes now neutral stable. And you get a new fixed point here that is unstable and correspond to this Alli threshold. So if you rephrase this fixed point plot in terms of the potential as a function of species and of the mean population n, you can basically consider that you have three different situations. So the Lotka-Volterra model is just defined by a quadratic parabolic potential, whereas the strong or the weak effect are framed respectively within a double well potential or a single well potential. The parameter that allows you to basically switch from one situation to the other is this parameter n that allows you to tilt the position of the two minima by passing through a spinodal transition. So here we repeat the same analysis as before, as done for the Lotka-Volterra model. So we consider the amplitude of the demographic noise as a function of the heterogeneity parameter, sigma. And there are different features, so there are some differences. So the first one is that at variance with the Lotka-Volterra case, we don't have three different phases, but we recognize just two different phases. A single equilibrium phase where the landscape is purely convex, and a multiple equilibria regime where the equilibria are marginally stable. So I plotted in blue the curve, the stability curve for the single equilibrium phase for the strong Alli effect, and in orange for the weak Alli effect. So this is the first difference, just two phases with no evidence of a true Gardner phase. And the functional response, when you look at the functional response, so how a single species is affected by a small, infinitesimally small perturbation. So when we look at the functional response, this functional response at variance, again, with the Lotka-Volterra model, does depend on the species abundance distribution, so on the species abundance is n star. And so when we look at the smallest eigenvalue of the stability matrix, compared to the Lotka-Volterra model, we have now an explicit dependence on is n star. And so this quantity has to be average over P of n star. The probability distribution of this species abundance is evaluated at a fixed point of the dynamics. So what we want you to do is to better characterize this multiple equilibria phase that, as I said, we know from the replica theory that is marginally stable. And so to do this, we rephrase this condition in terms of a condition for the probability distribution of this n star, or better, for the probability distribution of the local curvature of the effective potential. And so we wanted to understand, we wanted to figure out how this local curvature should be in such a way that when you consider multi-species excitation in your model, the system remains stable. So we performed two different approaches to different computation. One that is based on a dynamical cavity argument. So we plugged in our system a new species, and we study what is the effect of this new species on the overall species pool. And so we look in particular what is called the diagonal susceptibility, so this term that is how the species Ni is affected by a new perturbation that is psi I. And obviously this analysis performed in the zero demographic noise limit and without immigration, because this phase appears in the very, very low demographic noise regime. So we are considering this dynamical equation without noise and without immigration. And the second strategy is basically to analyze what happens to a model of Gaussian coupled potential. So we consider that the single species potential is basically stable, so it has a local curvature that is positive, and we analyze what happens when we consider multi-species excitation. So what is the minimal attainable value of this curvature in such a way that if you consider multi-species excitation in your system, the system remains stable. And so we perform a model that is captured by this cartoon. So you have a coupling of two double weld potential, just in a two-dimensional plane, and you want to study what is the condition for stability. So you want to study what is the condition for this Hessian matrix in such a way that your system remains stable. So in particular, as I said, we look at the minimal local curvature of this effective potential, and just assuming that our probability distribution at very small value of this local curvature scale has V effective of this curvature to an exponent alpha, we wanted to find what is the value of this alpha in such a way that the system remains stable. And so here we found a pseudo-gap distribution in the sense that this local curvature has to scale as 1 over n to an exponent 1 over 1 plus alpha, and alpha has to be strictly greater than 1 if you want to remain stable. So when alpha is greater than 1, the system is stable. And when an alpha is equal to 1, you get a marginally stable regime with possible logarithmic correction to this power law behavior. So just to conclude, I presented thus far two different models. So the first one is the Lotka-Volterra model with an increasingly large number of species and random interaction. And so in the presence of small demographic noise and high heterogeneity, we observe a multiple equilibria phase that we characterize both thermodynamically and dynamically. And in very low demographic noise regime and high heterogeneous interaction regime, we found another phase that we call a Gardner in analogy with glassy system. And then I want also to point out that this model can be mapped to random replicant models that have been of interest in many different fields like evolutionary game theory. And in the second part of the talk, I discuss what happens when you try to plug in your model intra-specific cooperative effect, where you observe different phases transition, and also a probability distribution, so a functional response that explicitly depends on these species abundances on which you have to eventually average. And then there are other work in progress. So what happens to this kind of dynamical equation when you introduce a notion of space? So you can model your ecosystem as correlated patches that are coupled by diffusion. And then you can try to study the different kind of transition that emerge in the second case. And another interesting perspective is to study what happens theoretically when you consider stronger and stronger interaction, not only in the symmetric case, but also in the asymmetric interaction regime. And so I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ada. That was intense. Is there questions over here?
Thank you very much. My question is it possible to estimate the number of equilibria when there are many?
Yes, so in this particular, yes, absolutely. So in this particular case, so when we have symmetric interaction, we estimate that number of equilibria is exponential into the number of species, because there is an exact computation, so we can perform a one-step replica symmetry breaking computation. So this complexity is strictly positive just in this region. And so here, the number of equilibria is exponential.
Well, thanks very much for your talk. So I was wondering, so you look at small perturbations, and one small perturbation would be just to remove a species. Would it make a difference, or can you attack this kind of a...
You mean in one of these phases, or in...
I mean, in the whole model. So when you consider the graph of interactions, then you can either move a bit the coefficients, which is what you do as far as you understand.
Yeah, in the cavity argument.
Yes.
So basically, removing one species, since we are considering the large as limit, does not affect our system. So the idea is that if we consider, so we have a something like a fully connected graph. So every species is connected with all the others. So the effect of plugging or removing one species does not affect the overall behavior. So this is a property that we...
Yeah, because you look at very many...
Exactly, and not on a sparse network on which this could change some of the behavior. But in this particular case, no, there is no difference. So also by using random matrix theory techniques, so it's somehow similar. So it's you get a similar behavior when you look at the ecosystem with n species or n-1 species. So part of the result have been derived with n-1 species, but with no strong influence on the final phase diagram and the final result.
Thank you.
One last question?
Concerning the asymmetric case, which I think you are prepared to this question, right? So the difference would be that in the symmetric case, you have a Lyapunov function, zero temperature.
Precisely. So
it's like in the Hopfield model of neural
exactly,
networks. Right?
Exactly.
As soon as you switch some asymmetric interaction, you don't have it anymore, right?
So
it's like having a kind of non-equilibrium problem already at the level.
Exactly. So the idea is that is precisely this. So when you have symmetric interaction, you can map your dynamical system into a Lyapunov function. When you don't have symmetric interaction, you can try to use other techniques like the dynamical mean field theory approach or the cavity method that allow you to write a very general framework when you also have asymmetric interaction. So I can give you some insight on how this phase diagram we expect it to be modified. So the first two phases, so this single equilibrium phase and the multiple equilibria phase should remain there because the equilibria are stable. So globally stable or locally stable. Whereas this other Gardner phase should be completely washed out because the equilibria there are marginally stable. And so we have also results from neural networks, domain, and so on, so the papers by Sola, Stein, and so on, in which basically they claim that when you switch on a small degree of asymmetry, this pink glass-like phase should be completely wiped out.
Okay.
But yes,
but
there
in
is...
sense it's like violating detailed balance in your model, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And another question concerning demographic noise is very natural for populations, right? It's very... usually in spin glass, you consider additive noise.
Yes.
If one would have some form of additive, like normal bath, I would say, would this everything change or?
We haven't studied yet this kind of perspective. That I could say that you can basically plug it into a dynamical mean field theory formalism in which you consider different sources of noises, and you can perform analysis analytically in any sense by using different kind of noises. So for instance, one possible perspective is not only to plug a noise that scales as square root of ni, but also a noise that scales as an ni. So this will account for an environmental noise. So the two scale, the scaling of the two noises are different. You will violate, again, the detailed balance condition, but you can still get prediction. But for the moment, we don't have a clear result in terms of the phase diagram. So.
All right, thank you. We should move on.